Okay, hi everyone. My name is John. I have to leave strictly at 4 o'clock because I'm doing admissions interviews for prospective undergraduate students, and there is absolutely no flexibility. So I apologize if I leave very quickly. I'm sorry about that. I will try to get through my presentation as quickly as possible. So first of all, a bit about my background. I research sort of two separate things. One is the psychology of misinformation, which I will be talking about, and second, I look at propaganda in the war in Ukraine. And there's two books that are coming out next year in case you're interested. The first one is out in May and the second should be out in August. They're both ready, but they are sort of waiting to be published sort of fairly soon. And that's these two books. So a lot of what I'll be saying will be based on information from these books. So first of all, we can talk about fake news, right? But it's really difficult to arrive at a definition. So this is an article that was published in 2012. This is an article by The Onion, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with The Onion. It's a satirical kind of fake news website, right? Run by from the United States. And the beautiful part about this story is that a Chinese news website, the People's Daily, thought that this was real, and they copied this article and posted it on their own website. With a whole like slideshow of pictures of Kim Jong-un sitting on a horse and that kind of thing. And so my point here is that it's really difficult to know exactly what kind of content to tackle, right? Because this is fake news completely, never happened, but it's also completely harmless because it's satire. So can we really call this fake news? Hard to say. And more importantly, the kind of content that is actually really harmful is often not completely fake, but sort of cleverly taps into certain biases and emotions and these kinds of things without explicitly lying, right? So that makes our effort to counter mis and disinformation much more complicated. Okay, what can we do to tackle misinformation? So this is sort of an overview of the different interventions that we have available, ranging from debunking and fact-checking to content labeling to boosting or teaching people how to spot misinformation, and nudging, which tackles behavior. And so those comprise the what you might call individual level interventions, the ones that target individual news consumers. And those interventions are okay. They have, you know, the best ones work relatively well, but they have a pretty small effect size. Either way, you have algorithms that you can change, right? Facebook recommender algorithms. You can tackle the business models. You can pass legislation like the Digital Services Act that the EU has just passed. But also you can look at geopolitics. For instance, you might discourage bad actors in a way from spreading more disinformation, right? But those are things that we as individuals or even as organizations find it very, 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 very difficult to tackle. Okay. What can we do in terms of debunking? It's very interesting how that works. So debunking, generally speaking, is effective, kind of, depending on what study you look at. But overall, you could say that if someone believes misinformation and that is then corrected through debunking or fact-checking, they believe it less afterwards. So that's quite helpful, quite nice to know. But it's also true that there's a lot we don't know about this. And so this is, for instance, a very interesting study that was published in 2017 by Fabiana Zollo and her colleagues from the University of Venice, where they looked at who engages with fact-checking posts on Facebook. And so they identified two different communities, one a conspiracy community and one a science community. And the difference is that the conspiracy community likes to look at sort of conspiratorial content on Facebook, and the science community likes to consume scientific content. And these two pie charts show engagement in terms of likes and comments with fact-checking posts on Facebook. And you can see that the conspiracy community only engages very little, whereas the science community engages a lot. And the problem here is that the conspiracy community, of course, is more likely to believe misinformation, and that basically means that it is possible that the people who might benefit the most from the fact checks don't really see them all that much, right? So that's difficult. Okay. Um, The work that I've done in the last couple of years focuses a lot on sort of countering misinformation preemptively through what you might call digital literacy or pre-bunking or inoculation, whichever term you prefer. And as part of that, I've done a couple of studies with these fake news games that we made, which are quite fun. I'm pretty sure for the bad news game, there's also a Latvian version. And if not for the bad news game, it will be available for the Harmony Square game in case you're interested. But I don't want to dwell on that for too long, basically in the interest of time. And so I want to focus on the lessons that we actually learned in the last couple of years. And those mainly have to do with this idea of scaling up the digital literacy interventions. And the thought behind that is that many of these interventions, including the games that I just mentioned, have a scalability problem. Which is to say, it's really hard to reach a large number of people with your interventions. And another problem is that the more scalable the intervention, the smaller the effect size, and more on that later. And then a final problem is that it's very hard to know how well these kinds of interventions work in the wild as opposed to just in the lab. In the interest of tackling these research questions, we published this study in Science Advances in late 2022, where we tested how well it works if you create short videos such as these that you then roll out to on social media, right? And so I'll skip over this in the interest of time, but basically we did a bunch of lab studies first, sort of randomized control trials done with online samples, where we tested if people's ability to recognize common misinformation techniques or manipulation techniques improved after watching the video, and they did. Seems uncontroversial, but nonetheless it is an important finding to establish first. So that's good news, but the more important element here is that we also went to the field. And by that, I mean we went to YouTube and we collaborated with YouTube to administer these videos as advertisements on the YouTube platform. And in total, we showed 2 of these videos to about 5 million people. And the nice thing was that we were also able to collect survey responses, both from people who had seen the video and people who had not, which is the control group. And in total, we collected about 22,000 of these responses. And what we found, what we did was basically this. So after watching a YouTube video, basically a random YouTube video, people were giving this question, evaluate this sentence. People are either part of the solution or they're part of the problem. And then the question that we administered within YouTube was, this sentence contains one of these 4 options. And the right answer here is a false dichotomy, right? Okay. And we did that for 6 different survey questions initially, and here you can see the results. So basically the x-axis here shows the increase in technique recognition. That's a bit hard to read. Basically, if that doesn't overlap with 0, it's good news. That means that the treatment group performs better than the control group. And here you can see the results. So overall, we have about a 5% improvement compared to the control group, which, you know, you could argue is not a lot, but at least it's a statistically significant finding, in the sense that we're pretty sure that this effect is real and not some kind of statistical artifact. Although, again, you could say that 5%, you know, what does it really mean if that's what we find? Okay. Now, there's a couple of problems with this approach, and one is that it cost $40,000. This study here costs $40,000 to run. That's an absurd amount of money. And that means that the study cannot be replicated independently by anyone else who isn't being given the same amount of money to do a study like this, right? So that it makes for a really, really, really bad science. And on top of that, it fosters a privilege that on the part of the researchers, but also on the part of the funders. In our case, that was Google, which leads to unwanted interdependence, right? Okay. Those are sort of I suppose, the philosophical concerns with this kind of study, but there are practical concerns as well that are actually extremely relevant. And so in that light, there was a study that we did this year, actually, still under review, but I'm happy to present you the results. And the study leads, or several studies, I should say, study leads are Raccoon Martens, now at the University of Oxford, and Georgia Capewell, who was an undergraduate student last year at the University of Cambridge in psychology. And they wanted to look at the longevity of the effect, which is to say, how long do these effects remain significant over time, right? Okay. And so in this study that Raccoon Martens recently led, we wanted to see what the longevity of this effect was of the effectiveness of three types of these kinds of interventions: reading something, just a piece of text, watching a video, and playing a game, in our case, the bad news game. And what we did, which is a little bit technical, is we wanted to look at testing effects. And what that basically means is in some of our participants were shown the piece of text or watched the video or they played the game, and then immediately after they did some kind of task to basically test their ability to recognize misinformation, right? And so some of them, so here, for example, you can see group one, the video, this is the video, and then immediately after you have the measurement. And then group two, we had the video and then nothing, and then 12 days later we had the measurement. See what I mean? And basically we wanted to see if these two groups differ from one another, in the sense that we wanted to know if this testing moment helps people remember what they watched in the video. Okay. And what we found was that basically if people rehearse the lessons from the video immediately after watching, then the effect was significant for about 30 days. And if you didn't do that, it disappeared after 10 days. Right? So that basically means that watching the video in and of itself did not give as strong an effect as watching the video and then also conducting some kind of exercise straight after. I'll skip over this because it's, again, I don't really have the time to discuss this in detail, but our undergraduate student, Georgia, reduced this testing moment, right, to this time span to about 48 hours. And you can see here the study design that she implemented. We had 4 different groups, right, two inoculation groups and 2 control groups. And in the inoculation group, they watched the video, and then one group did the testing moment immediately after, and then again 48 hours later. And then group 2, that's the most important group, they only did that testing moment 48 hours later, not immediately after. And then we had 2 control groups that watched an unrelated video and then did the same thing. Okay, the research question here is, how quickly does this effect disappear if people don't rehearse the information that they learn in the video? And these are the results. So, as you will recall, group 1, right? 2 testing moments. This shows the performance on the test at time 2, which is 48 hours after watching. And you can see that the group 1 is very different from groups 2, 3, and 4, right? So basically that means that group 1 is much better at correctly identifying misinformation 48 hours after watching the video than group 2. Which is to say, both groups watched the same video, and the only difference is that immediately after watching, group 1 did a little test, and that on its own was enough to still see that effect 48 hours later, whereas for the group 2 that did nothing and then only did the test 48 hours later, they performed exactly the same as both control groups. Right? Okay. Now, that's not really a surprise for memory researchers, if there is any of you in the room, because this study by Bird and colleagues from 2015 found that people who actively rehearsed the content of a video were much better at recall after 1 week and after 2.5 weeks than people who had not done any rehearsal. And so you can see that here, basically. This shows recall on the y-axis, and then here, this condition is the condition that did no rehearsal, and these are the ones that did do some kind of rehearsal. So you see that there's a massive difference between these two. Okay. In my view, this shows fairly convincingly, I would say, that the rehearsal should be seen as a critical component of the intervention. In other words, you can expect the effect to disappear very quickly without some kind of exercise that encodes the lessons from the intervention into memory. Now, this effect isn't immediate, right? It's not like 2 minutes later the effect is gone. That's not true. It's just it goes away very quickly. Rather serious problem, because this holds up in my mind for most, if not all, learning-based misinformation interventions, including media literacy tips, videos, media literacy programs, and so on. Right? And more problematically, this also means that the videos themselves, let's say, are not really enough. We need to somehow entice people to also rehearse what they learned in the video, or maybe watch the video a ton of times. Maybe that helps too. Hard to say. Either way, this is good to bear in mind that we can't expect people to remember the critical information without any kind of rehearsal. I hope that makes sense. Okay. Not all hope is lost, luckily, and that's why we have my friend Andras here. He's sort of raising his thumb because he's not completely depressed about the findings, because more intensive interventions such as games and media literacy programs are less easy to scale on social media, but they can more easily incorporate memory strengthening exercises. And what do I mean by that? Last year somewhere we conducted well, not we, but two of our colleagues, Johannes Leda and Lukas Schellinger from the University of Bamberg in Germany, conducted two pre-registered studies where they wanted to know, well, what happens if you provide people with some kind of feedback on their performance on these kinds of tasks, right? You tell them this is the answer you got right, and this is what you got wrong, and here's why, effectively. And that led to a substantial improvement. This is too hard to interpret just from looking at it very briefly. But basically what they found was that people became much better when you gave them some feedback at correctly identifying real news and fake news, both 1 week after they played the game. So that's very nice. That basically means that the effect stays significant for much longer if you entice people to rehearse the lessons from the game. Okay. And then what we did afterwards was, like, we were like, well, that's all well and good. Those are some lab studies, right? But we kind of want to see if that makes sense in the real game as well. So we also created this feedback exercise that we've now implemented in our game called Bad News, and also in Harmony Square, where basically you play through the game as normal, and then at the end of the game tells you, okay, if you're so smart, here's a headline, can you tell me if it's misleading or not misleading? And then whatever you choose, basically the game tells you, asks you what makes you think the headline is misleading, and then you can say, well, it evokes strong emotions, or it's conspiratorial, or it's polarizing, or something like that. And then you get feedback based on how well you did. Like, either you get it right, you get it wrong, you gain some points if you get it right, and you lose some points if you get it wrong. That we thought was a very neat way of incorporating this kind of memory strengthening exercise. And what you see is that if you do that, here you see on the left, you see the performance on this task in terms of how good people are identifying misinformation. With the feedback exercise implemented and without the feedback exercise implemented. And you see this is about the same. There's no significant difference between these two. Then you look at how good people are at identifying real news, right? Not non-misinformation. And there the feedback condition does way better than the no feedback condition. And then finally, that also leads to a much better what you call discernment, which is an ability to distinguish between true and false information, is boosted substantially by the inclusion of this kind of feedback exercise. Okay. It appears that these kinds of feedback exercises are critical for the effectiveness and longevity of boosting interventions, as they help encode the lessons from the interventions into memory. And this has pretty substantial implications for the design of these kinds of interventions. So basically what I would recommend is for people who are seeking to develop digital literacy interventions that they find find a way to for participants to practice and rehearse the lessons that you want them to learn in some kind of task, preferably an entertaining one where they can gain or lose points or something like that. And if that is successfully done, then we know that the effect becomes much stronger and also stays much more significant over time for much longer periods. Okay. I'm almost at time, so I just wanted to thank my collaborators. These are some of them, and so thank you very much for your time and attention.